If you're watching this, you're about to see something that most in the Westminster media and political elite bubble hoped would stay buried. We're going to be talking about survivors of the UK's worst grooming gang scandals that are walking away from the national inquiry that Labour launched in disgust. 5 of them this week alone already have left, citing that the inquiry basically is just a great big massive cover-up to the Labour Party's failings, but also of the Pakistani grooming gangs in general. Now, meanwhile, the minister in charge, Jess Phillips, she's insisted that everything is fine right up until she had a literal emotional breakdown on TV in the House of Commons. And in this video, I'm going to explain this entire scandal for you. I'm going to break out why this scandal erupted seemingly out of nowhere and how Starmer, Phillips, and the Labour Party as a whole are directly responsible for these failings. I really do think, actually, I don't think this is too far, that there's real criminality going on here, that in reality, this criminality can only be answered with whole life sentences for the politicians, the police officers, the social workers, and the grooming gangs themselves who were involved. But unfortunately, that's just off the table. And in my opinion, there'll be no real reconciliation or respite for the Labour government here because they are institutionally corrupt and morally bankrupt. And this scandal, for once, actually, I think, has the potential to take down the entire government eventually. Now, let's start by taking just a little step back and make sure we're all up to date on the background behind this scandal. Grooming gangs and the scandals behind them in general began decades ago, right? But they've been covered up by politicians, by police, by social workers and the media for years in an attempt to defend the idea of multiculturalism because some people feared being racist. Now, it wasn't until Elon Musk brought mass media attention to the ethnic makeup of the grooming gangs on X, the media, the political elite, they had literally denied the existence of this problem on an ethnic basis for decades, but they can't really hide it anymore because of what Elon Musk did. So first of all, thank you, Elon. Then Labour directly implicated in many of these grooming gangs, right, because the local governments, the towns these places happened in were often run by Labour councils and politicians. And in June of 2025, Labour gets huge amounts of criticism for opposing a national inquiry into the grooming gangs, only to then actually put in place a national inquiry in the Commons after voting against one, right? So they finally changed their mind and U-turned, launching that national inquiry. This was supposed to, in Labour's opinion, shut down debate. What Labour really wanted from this was basically the ability to say that, look, we can't comment on grooming gang issues right now because there's a national inquiry going on and we have to wait until it's completed. That was the aim, and to drag the inquiry out until it was completed after the next election is already done, so they get 10 clean years in power before they're finally ousted. On the surface, they could claim they're doing everything right, trying to bring justice to victims, ensuring that this problem is fixed forever, but obviously most people don't really believe that for good reason, which is one of the reasons that Labour's polling has suffered so much as a result of this entire scandal. Now, what's actually driving this specific scandal, and why has it picked up so much steam very, very quickly? Well, it starts about a week ago when reports start to emerge that survivors from the panel, these members, were prevented from attending interviews with potential chairs of the inquiry. Now, the panel of survivors was supposed to exist to guide the government on the inquiry, in particular to help them choose a chair who would actually bring them justice, but many of those survivors have been blocked from speaking with the candidates, meaning that they can't possibly direct the inquiry into a successful direction. And the panel has now been exposed really as merely an attempt to make it look like the inquiry cares, when in reality, they want to appoint someone friendly to the Labour government. Then it gets exposed that the inquiry has been expanded to cover child sexual exploitation in general and not just grooming gangs, certainly a problem that needs addressing, but thus will water down that racial, the ethnic component of this inquiry, and it will basically act as an abort button that allows the Labour government to continue pretending there's not a problem with the Pakistani ethnicity in these grooming gangs in particular, when we all know that's the truth. And as a result of all of this, 2 grooming gang victims quit the inquiry. That then expanded to 5 who quit because they were already feeling betrayed about the attempt of the inquiry to refocus away from grooming gangs, away from the Pakistani men who predominantly committed these crimes as well. Then these victims who had already quit the board, they explicitly called out ministers for doing this and name-checked Jess Phillips as well, saying that it is a blatant lie for Jess Phillips to suggest that there has been no conversation about expanding the inquiry's scope beyond grooming gangs. So they are actively saying that she is lying. Then Jim Gamble, an ex-police chief who was a candidate to head up the inquiry, he then pulled out as well after claiming that the inquiry wasn't focused on actually facing up to the issue, but was instead about political point scoring. funnily enough, I'm seeing some people try to blame Reform for this here, but in my opinion, that is pretty much impossible because there's not a single member of the Reform Party involved in the inquiry. It's exclusively made up of the political elite from parties like Labour, and this is clearly, in my opinion, related to Labour's attempt to manipulate the inquiry and its findings for their own preferred outcome that doesn't hurt their chance of winning an election. And then finally, another few victims publicly resign. They all call on Jess Phillips to be fired. They say that they will only consider returning back to the inquiry if she resigns because she has been actively fighting against them and trying to water down the inquiry. They said, being publicly contradicted and dismissed by a government minister when you are a survivor telling the truth takes you right back to that feeling of not being believed all over again. So pretty horrific stuff, and it makes sense that this is turning into a scandal when you actually hear about the facts. Then we have Jess Phillips completely melting down in the House of Commons after being attacked by countless politicians, journalists and victims of these grooming gangs as a result of her attempts to protect the criminals behind these scandals.
Minister.
Can I just be completely clear? I'm suggesting that I will listen completely and utterly to the feedback from the victims that were and still are on. That they are not spreading misinformation at all, but his interpretation is a brilliant case in point, because I will be completely honest, the conversation with Oldham is, do we not think it might be better for them just to take part in a statutory inquiry? That it is absolutely nothing to do with the idea that Oldham is telling me what to do. And the more people from that side, he can hold up his paper and have a smug face all he likes, but the fact of the matter is that there is absolutely no council in this country who will tell this inquiry where it can and cannot go. I have said that 1,000,000 times from this dispatch box, and yet the same thing gets peddled again and again.
So after being completely exposed by the actual victims of these grooming gangs, she loses her temper and explodes in the Commons, completely incapable of controlling her emotions when she gets exposed as failing in her duty to protect these women. So we have survivors leaving in disgust at the attempted, literal whitewash of the inquiry to try and pretend that it's a generic problem of men committing these acts and has nothing to do with the ethnicity of the men. We have a minister denying dilution while simultaneously breaking down in the House of Commons and exposing to us all once and for all not only how she's a little bit disgraceful on this on a personal level for betraying these people, but also how angry she is that we, the public, are seeing through her lies and calling her out for the traitor that she is. And then we have chair candidates walking away because they're disgusted at what they see, and the government desperately proclaiming confidence and surety that this inquiry will solve the problem and fix anything, right as literally nothing happens for almost an entire year now. Now here comes the uncomfortable truth about this scandal and why Labour are on the side of literal child rapists. This isn't about policing or protecting children, it's about politics. Labour has long championed multiculturalism, community cohesion and rights frameworks, that whole melting pot nonsense, the idea that British food is awful and it's 100% essential for our palates that we have, foreign food come into the country and that there is nothing possibly that could ever go wrong with mass immigration, that it's a perfect idea and there's no, favourable or even acceptable critiques of this. The UK has always been multicultural, multiracial and built by immigrants, or even the English people don't even exist and that we aren't entitled to have an ethnicity. But the simple, irrefutable fact here is that Pakistanis in the UK are hugely overrepresented in the grooming and rape of children, and that is simply not possible to pass this off as isolated incidents anymore. It's a wider problem within that community across our entire country. Many of the towns affected are also working class and very mixed ethnically, right, because of mass immigration. These used to be, 60, 70 years ago, almost entirely, talking 99% white working class towns. Places like Rotherham, where literally 99% of the population was white British 60, 70 years ago. And then at the exact same time as deindustrialization of the country took place and these white working class communities were left behind to struggle with poverty for decades, these towns that used to vote Labour heavily because they supported the working man, over recent decades, Labour changed and it started to prioritise the liberal elite in wealthy places like central London and the immigrant populations which moved into these old working class towns. And that means that actually these towns still mostly vote Labour, but that's not because of the coal mining history or the heavy industry history or the idea that, my dad was a coal miner. It's because Labour panders to immigrants and in particular Pakistani immigrants. And that minority vote is incredibly politically significant. Labour fear being accused of racism if they highlight ethnicity within these grooming gangs, and they don't want to lose the votes and lose their jobs, so instead they covered everything up and pretended that nothing was wrong. Labour spent the first 6 months of their time in government objecting to a national inquiry, claiming that it wasn't necessary, that it wouldn't actually help, that it would make things worse, even claiming that this is far-right talking points aimed at stirring up racial hatred. Jess Phillips in specifics, the person running the national inquiry, literally voting against having one. I mean, how on earth is she supposed to guide it to a functional end when she is ideologically opposed to its mere existence? And Jess Phillips has even gone so far as actively trying to ignore the term grooming gangs, refusing to say it on multiple occasions because that alone is now a politically charged term that damages her entire political philosophy. So instead she uses the term group-based child sexual exploitation because it doesn't have those racial connotations with it. And that's the other really important thing to consider here. It's the ideological contradictions that hold Labour back from seeking justice and actually fixing the problem. The left outright believes that diversity is a strength, without a doubt. The more different we are, the better we are. The more religions we practice, the healthier the country is. And there's just no evidence to prove this. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence to disprove it entirely at this point. But this is a founding tenet of leftism in 2025. Immigrants are always good, different cultures are always good, different religions are always good, even when certain religions or cultures are themselves racist or intolerant. And so Labour is ideologically hamstrung. They're not capable of admitting there's a problem with Pakistani men because then the entire political aim of increasing diversity is sort of exposed as a scam. Now, we often hear talk of the media covering up for the grooming gangs in a bid to save multiculturalism, and this expands far beyond, outright socialists or politicians or billion-dollar newspapers or the typical media elite. And I'm going to show you an example of an egregious rewriting of history carried out by what is supposedly an unbiased new media outlet here on YouTube. This here is TLDR. They're a YouTube-based news organization with a few different channels. They cover politics for a younger audience. They're only, I think, less than a decade old, but they are pretty well established and they're actually really reputable. They've interviewed Labour ministers and government officials, and they are now firmly, sadly, a tool of the establishment to try and control the narrative when it comes to these grooming gangs. And for the most part, they do make good content. It's enjoyable and informative, but they have their biases. Now, in early 2025, two of the editors released this podcast, Is Elon Musk Radicalizing the Far Right? Now, the main topic for this 45-minute long podcast is basically Elon Musk is evil, grooming gangs aren't an Islamist problem, and Jess Phillips is beyond reproach and can't be criticized. Now, this organization, again, claims to be unbiased, non-partisan, and only interested in the news. But that organization is the product of those who work within it, and this podcast shows just how biased these people are, and I'll let you see this for yourself.
Reports happened, and not only that, but one of the things that Musk had criticised was Jess Phillips, who's been again, and I think this is an important thing to point out as well, is that people across the political spectrum do a lot of work in different areas that sort of is outside of the ordinary scope of politics. So I think it's absolutely legitimate to praise certain politicians for the work they do on certain issues, and that not be like a political thing. Jess Phillips has been a fairly tireless campaigner for safety of women and girls for basically her entire career. I mean, it's one of the things she's most known for as a politician.
We should clarify her official title is Parliamentary Undersecretary of State for Safeguarding and Violence Against Women and Girls.
And she's been attacked by Musk in the last week, and
do you want to reuse the phrase that Musk?
I don't have it written down, so I'd prefer you to.
So sure, Musk has accused Jess Phillips of being a rape genocide apologist.
And that is an attack made against someone who is known most in politics for her campaigning and her work on violence against women and girls.
Yeah.
And again, if it was the Conservative Party or other parties sort of 10 years ago or 5 years ago even, I think all parties would be turning around and saying that's wrong. And if Jess Phillips was a Conservative, equally I think that 5-10 years ago people would be turning around and defending her. I think that this is a thing that sort of supersedes the day-to-day politics. There is a point of sort of courtesy and professional respect between politicians that has existed, and you can criticise each other for not doing this when you're in government, not doing this, but for that language to be used against a politician, I don't think it's a political thing to defend against that language, especially when it's against someone who has worked quite a lot in that field to be criticised for not doing enough. So I find it interesting that there hasn't been more defence outside of the Labour Party of Jess Phillips in this regard. Again, I think we'll get onto this later.
We will get back onto it.
Yeah.
So I quote, Jess Phillips has been a tireless campaigner for women and girls. Her official title is Parliamentary Undersecretary of State for Safeguarding and Violence Against Women and Girls, and Musk has accused Jess Phillips of being a rape genocide apologist. Those are 3 quotes that directly came from them there. Now, Jess Phillips has always campaigned for safety of women and girls, yes, except she has distinctly not campaigned for their safety and of women and girls when the offenders are Pakistani men and when the victims are working class white girls, children in particular. She has actively ignored the safety of women and girls and contributed to the mass grooming gangs all around the country for literally years on end. These reports right here are direct evidence of that being the truth. Jess Phillips is the person trying to stop the national inquiry from being about grooming gangs to make it about child sexual exploitation in general. She's doing that so that she doesn't offend her minority voters. And these podcasters are using the appeal to authority fallacy, stating that her title, acting as if just having the title of, safeguarding women and girls makes her immune to criticism, even though the actual victims are saying that she is working against them and calling her a liar. This is a perfect example of how the media or the left in general try to excuse not only the grooming gangs themselves, but they're trying to downplay and ignore the racial link, but the cover-up too, acting as if these inquiries are about, justice and actually helping the victims. Now, what are the political consequences of this scandal, these revelations? For Labour, the party's reputation is just a stain of its former reputation at this point, right? The inquiry is seen as half-baked. They're trying to avoid naming the problem of Pakistani men as much as they can, which is harming trust among voters, especially those who already feel abandoned, and the public's trust in institutions is already incredibly weak. And just a few years ago, the government could get away with ignoring that Pakistani connection because the legacy media was so committed to stamping out any mention of the demographic makeup of those grooming gangs. But since Elon Musk bought Twitter, turned it into X, and brought attention to the grooming gangs, the legacy media and government, they have no choice but to address it directly, and now it's a simple, widespread fact. Now, as an example of just how deep this goes, for a while I worked with a Pakistani young man. I say Pakistani, he's British, but Pakistani heritage. Both parents from Pakistan, he's a second generation, and he's raised in the UK, lived here in his entire life. And he let slip once while we were chatting, because we worked together, that he literally believed the Pakistani grooming gangs were a far-right conspiracy theory with zero basis in reality. The Pakistanis were not any more likely to be convicted of any kind of paedophile-related offence. This was 3 years ago, and he only had the ability to think that because the legacy media and the government claimed it was a far-right conspiracy, and that the only people talking about it were those on the fringe, like Tommy Robinson, who are seen by most British people as extremist or racist. Now the truth is out, and Labour can't hide it anymore without huge political backlash, because the truth has been exposed by Elon Musk. Now, the political fallout from this has forced another impending scandal from this entire situation, right? Jess Phillips and the Labour Party, they have to make a decision right now. Her being on the inquiry and not resigning is directly harming the ability of the inquiry to do its job. So if she doesn't resign, she's literally saying, I value my job, my prestige, my career, my Wikipedia page above the justice of the literal thousands of children who were abused. And if she does resign, she's acknowledging her failings and the fact that she was so toxic and betrayed these survivors so badly that she was forced out. And Starmer faces problems from it as well. Does he sack Jess Phillips? Well, no, he's not going to. We know that. It makes him look a little bit stronger personally, but it also reflects personally poorly on him too, right? Because he can argue that, he put the victims first this time, but he's the one who appointed her in the first place, and he's already been on record defending her multiple times, including literally yesterday at the time I'm recording this video. So everyone knows he doesn't actually care. And so instead, Starmer probably won't sack Jess Phillips. Instead, he and the Labour Party will once again be exposed as apologists for these grooming gangs because they care about their careers and polling and the votes more than the children being abused. The longer that Labour refuse to act, the greater the media and the narrative risk. Reform are capitalising on this to an incredible degree, releasing a press conference with one of the victims who actively went out there and got rid of her anonymity to speak to the public and say, Jess Phillips in particular has betrayed me. The inquiry is being delayed and diluted, manipulated, right? This hands a clear win to parties on the right, mostly Reform, so they're the strongest supporters of justice for the victims. And they're able to claim, with reputation on the line here, that actually, yes, Labour and the liberal elites refuse to face the truth about these grooming gangs, which is now the truth. Now, it's clear this is going to have a huge impact on the inquiry itself. Chair candidates walking away, survivors resigning, ministers denying cover-ups. We now have Reform and Nigel Farage's plan and proposals for fixing the inquiry. But I think that the backlash is now so severe that a cover-up can't possibly continue. And we're almost certainly going to see changes to the inquiry now. The inquiry actually outright starting, at the end, right, stating, that yes, Pakistanis are hugely overrepresented in child sexual assault and grooming gangs. And this isn't limited to just small towns or isolated incidents. It's a problem across the entire country. The problem with the inquiry, in my opinion, is that it is an inquiry. What should be happening is that 10 to 20,000 people should have their doors kicked down in the middle of the night by armed police and they're arrested for crimes against children. Yes, the grooming gangs, the abusers themselves, but every single policeman or social worker or teacher or politician who knew about these abuses and failed to protect these children, who buried the reports, who refused to acknowledge the problem for the sake of politics or for fear of being called racist, until every single one of those criminals are actually brought to justice for being too cowardly to defend children, sentenced to many, many years in prison, then there will be no real justice here. And an inquiry is really just a show trial with no sentencing and no one actively punished for their wrongdoings. As always, this is a new channel. Let me know what you think of the video, of the format, of my opinions, of the way I speak, of anything. I'm always happy to receive constructive criticism. Let me know in the comments down below what you think I should be talking about, what I'm missing out on, maybe why it's taken me so long to get these videos out. I do have a job outside of this. This is not my full-time thing. So this is all done in the last hour or two of each night when I'm too bored to watch TV or something instead. So yeah, leave down below in a comment what you think I should be looking at next or any suggestions or criticisms you have of what I'm doing so far. Cheers.